Our next presenter has been a long friend of the Miami people. He began doing the groundbreaking linguistic research in 1988. David Costa has been associated with us since that time, and more recently has become a contract consultant to the Myaamia project and now works with us on a full-time basis from his home in El Cerrito, California. We asked David to do this presentation every now and then because it's always good to take another look at where we're at in terms of the materials and the process of using those materials. So David's going to give us a summary on that, surveying the sources. So here is David Costa. Shaingo kila nika pialo. Shikianengo.
I was asked to speak today about the sources that we have in the Miami, Illinois language because for people who are not... Oh, sorry, I'm not used to speaking in this big a hall. I was asked to speak about the sources on the Miami, Illinois language. In other words, for people who are not directly involved with the Miami language program, it's often not really known where on earth are we getting all this data from. And I know some of you who've talked to me over the years are aware of this, but it's actually quite amazing. See here. It may take a while to prepare. Much better. We are extremely fortunate that the Miami language is in fact one of the best documented languages of native North America, as luck would turn out. And the language is extremely extensively documented for more than 240 years, from the best records being from the 1690s through the 1930s. And the language was first documented. There's going to be some overlap here. You'll hear some of the same names that Tracy mentioned in his talk by French Jesuit missionaries in the late 1690s and the early 1700s, resulting in 3 dictionaries. And the most extensive English language documentation, the stuff I started out with when I first began working on this 23 years ago, of Miami, Illinois, took place from the 1890s to the 1930s with the last generation of sort of first generation, of fluent speakers. To clarify my terminology for people who haven't, heard me talk about this before, the Miami, Illinois language is a cover term I'm using that's sometimes synonymous with Miami or Myaamia. In this, it's a collection of dialects, of extremely similar dialects, consisting of Myaamia, spoken in Indiana and later Oklahoma as well. Peoria, spoken by the Illinois, which is the cover term for the Illinois dialects spoken by those groups that were removed to Oklahoma. Wea, which is spoken in Indiana, then later Oklahoma. And Illinois, and I use the term Illinois as a cover term for those dialects as they were still spoken in the state of Illinois in the 1700s and earlier. The French Jesuit materials on Illinois, which are extremely extensive, consist of 4 main documents, though there may still be more out there, but these are the ones we know of. There's the Sebastian Rall prayer book from the 1690s, which may be Miami proper, Myaamia. Pinette's French Wea, or possibly French Miami dictionary, which was compiled between 1696 and 1702. The Gravier, Largelier, Illinois French Dictionary, which was probably from around 1700 to 1710. And the Laboulanger French Illinois Dictionary from around 1720. And I should let you know that it's actually it's quite exceptional for a native language of North America to have this kind of documentation from that long ago. It's quite rare. And to start with, the first of these sources is the Sebastian Rall prayer book, which I think Tracy has probably looked at. Sebastian Rall was a missionary who lived from 1657 to 1724. He worked mainly among the Myaamiaki in Maine, and if you know anything about the history of Maine, he was famously killed by the British Army at an Myaamiaki mission in Maine. But he spent some time with the Miami and copied out the prayer book, but probably didn't compose it. But it's the earliest document we know. It was probably translated by Father Allouet, who Tracy mentioned earlier, at the St. Joseph Mission at Miami, near Niles, Michigan, among the Miami in the 1680s. So it may be Miami proper. It was copied in the early 1690s, probably at Myaamiaki in Michigan. It's 185 pages, and it's a collection of prayers, instructions, and catechisms in the Myaamia language. And as I said here before, it's written in a different dialect, noticeably, with some significantly different words from the later Illinois materials. And it's valuable for examples of grammar, though I'm not really clear yet how fluent its syntax is. And this is an example of what this looks like, about 100, I can't remember what I said, about 180 something pages that look like this. And I've keyed these onto computer, and I sort of use this as a source of vocab and grammar. So I have done for a long time. The first really big source on the Myaami Illinois language, however, is the dictionary of Pierre-François Pinette, which was only found in 1999. It was found in an obscure provincial archive in Quebec. Pierre-François Pinette was born in France in 1660 and died in St. Louis in 1702. None of the missionaries who ever went to New France or to Illinois country ever seemed to make it back to Europe or to France. He established the Guardian Angel Mission at Chicago in 1696, which some older sources have said to be Miami, but which may actually have been inhabited by Weas. It's not entirely certain, but it's clear that it's probably not Illinois proper. In 1700, he moved to southern Illinois and lived his last years among the Tamaroa and Kaskaskias, the missions that the Jesuits later really intensively worked at. And the dictionary is 574 pages, French to Miami, Illinois, and it's extremely unpolished, and I am convinced it was composed in the field as he was learning the language, but, basically out in Illinois country. And this is what I like to cite to people as one of the more messy examples of what this document can look like. And this was just found and filmed, as a matter of fact. It was MTO financed the filming of this document several years ago, and they've made a very high resolution digital copy of it. But this is one of the reasons why we're hesitant to try to do an edition of this manuscript, is because too much of it looks like this, but it's still extremely useful. But this is unfair to just sort of say it all looks like this. For most of his dictionary, Pinette's organizational strategy was French head words would be entered in alphabetical order. He would leave space between the head words, and there would be anywhere from 1 word to 3 pages of Myaamia words and example sentences underneath them. And so, just as an example, this is actually a more example of a much more user-friendly page from Pinette's dictionary. This is an example of Pinette's month names that he got. And fortunately, almost everybody who worked on Myaamia over 240 years got the Myaamia calendar, the system of the month names. And many of these are still familiar from the more modern sources, as you'll see later on. Like, so for example, for the month of January, you may recognize that Esipana Kiriswa, which is raccoon month. And for February, the word for February is, or term for February is literally crane month, and so forth. What else? Or for August is elk month. And another example of some data from Pinette is he got extensive tree names, which is quite handy here. You can see, for example, that down the middle of the page, Erab is a name for maple that he got, names of trees, and also sets of verbs having to do with different actions that you might do involving trees and that sort of thing. This is like I said, this is taken down probably in the 1690s near Chicago. And this is an example of Pinette's corn terms. Corn was obviously extremely important to the Illinois tribes and pretty much all the southern Great Lakes tribes at this time. And this is a part of the first of 3 pages of corn terminology that Pinette got at the time. And so, so there's a term there at the top, a red grain of corn, large white corn, yellow corn, and so forth. And there's extensive sets of verbs having to do with, farming corn, cultivating it, and so forth, harvesting it. The next big document that's really important in Myaamia research, and in fact, this is the document that we have just recently been told we got the grant to edit, actually, is the dictionary of Father Antoine Robert Laboulanger. And he was born in France in 1664 and died in Illinois in 1744. He was at the Kaskaskia, Illinois mission by 1719. His dictionary is 185 pages, French to Miami, Illinois. And it not only contains words, but also 42 pages of religious texts, a long translation of Genesis, and 3 pages of verb paradigms. And like Pinette, it's organized by French headwords, where they listed French words and left spaces between them, with anywhere from 1 word to pages and pages of words after them. But unlike Pinette, it was obviously written down later. It was obviously composed later in a, more probably at some mission or something, and it's much easier to read. It's sorted and carefully preserved, much more carefully preserved. I've actually held it, and it's astonishingly well maintained. I mean, it's like it was immediately put into a vault after it was written out. And it has a lot of data shared with the Pinette dictionary. So a lot of the data in the Pinette dictionary was copied over into the new manuscript, which was probably written out about 20 plus years later. And as an example of what the Laboulanger dictionary we'll be working with looks like, this is an example of a page of his data for kinship terminology under parent. And there's as an example of just how much time the missionaries had spent with the Illinois, they had mastered, or very nearly mastered, the Illinois Myaamia kinship system, which is extremely different from that, which bears much more complex than that of English. And they had a good understanding of the differences between it and how it was unlike that of French. And this contains not only all the different terms for different types of relations and so forth, but also terms for marriage, terms for having children and that sort of thing. This has been extremely helpful in my kinship research for Myaamia. This is another typical example. This is in a list of Laboulager's bird names under oiseau. And the very first entry is Awasenza, which you might recognize from the materials as just the closest thing there is to a generic word for bird. And there's some terms in here that we don't know from the modern language, but which are very interesting, like that second thing he gives there, pipingwaki. Pipingwaki is translated as bird of prey. So one problem is some of the translations are a little vague because the French didn't always have the terminology to render what these terms were. And this is Laboulager's set of month names. It's extremely similar to Pinette's set of month names. He has raccoon month for January as well. He may have either copied it out from Pinette's dictionary, or it may have just been that the community he lived with simply had the same set of names. And this is just, in case you're curious, so this is Laboulager's translation of Genesis. This is page 1 of 13. I have keyed all of this on a computer. I have not tackled a translation of it. I can tell from looking at it preliminarily that it's not hyperliteral. He kind of played with the concepts and semantics to make it more interpretable to the audience. But this is what it looks like, and it goes to, it's the full length and 13 pages like this, and it's extremely useful for vocabulary, grammar, and that sort of thing. I plan to try to translate it someday. And this is a close-up of what it looks like, just for reference. This document was just recently filmed last fall by the library in Rhode Island that holds it, which is an extremely happy coincidence, given that it will be very useful to us. Closer to the mic? Okay, I'm sorry. And that's because I mentioned it here. Laboulanger also, this was incredibly helpful for my writing of the grammar, was that Laboulanger has 3 pages of verb paradigms, and 3 pages doesn't sound like much, but the pages are about 20 inches long and about 10 inches wide and filled with very small fine print, and they all look like this. And almost every possible thing you can do to a verb is in one of these paradigms, in these sheets. They missed almost nothing. And it's quite remarkable that about 300 years ago they understood this well, because by the 1800s and early 1900s, no white people understood Algonquian verbs this good anymore. It had to all be relearned, so to speak. And this is a list of his corn terms. I should probably pick up the pace here, actually. I'm getting limited in time. But you see here it starts with the very first term for corn, minchipi, the regular default word for corn, aurumina, which is a word for wild oats or water oats that grow and so forth. Or the second term down there, wiskapi, minchipi, is sweet corn. And this is the second page, just to let you know how extensive it is. The next really big document, and possibly the biggest one of the whole bunch, is the dictionary of Jacques Gravier and Jacques Largillier. Gravier was a Jesuit missionary born in France in 1651. He arrived in Illinois in 1689 and died in Mobile, Alabama in 1708. And Laboulanger was born in France around 1644, arrived in Illinois around 1674, and died in 1714. And from handwriting analysis, we've recently figured out, Michael McCaffrey has figured out, that Laboulanger wrote out the dictionary. It's his handwriting. The handwriting went unidentified for a very long time. Though Gravier, missionary Gravier, probably compiled it. And the dictionary is 586 pages. It's Myaamia, unlike the others, it's Miami, Illinois to French, not the other way around. And since the dictionary is sorted by Illinois words, there are no entries organized by semantic field like the month, set of month names or the set of corn terms or that sort of thing, like in the Pinette and Laboulanger dictionaries. But in this dictionary, it has more data than either of the other two put together. And you can look up Miami, Illinois words in it. So if you have a word that you're not certain of the meaning of, you can actually go to it and find out what it means, which you cannot easily do in the other two. And this is a typical example of what this document looks like. I chose this not entirely at random. You can see there's down in that second set of phrases is Myaamia, Miami people. That was how the phrase Myaamia was pronounced 300 years ago, Myaamia. And this is another typical page, like I said, 580 or so pages of this. And it's an astonishing amount of data that I may never fully get to the bottom of. The next person I want to talk about is Charles Trowbridge. Trowbridge lived from 1880 to 1800 to 1883. He worked as an assistant secretary for the Indian Department of the Great Lakes. He worked with the Myaamia in Indiana in the winter of 1824 to 1825, and he collected extensive oral history and cultural details, as well as hundreds of words, paradigms, and example sentences. And we've now found, we have microfilms of some of his materials, and some were published, but we now found that his original notes, which we need to go look at someday soon, are at the Detroit Public Library and Bentley Library at Ann Arbor, because we're not sure we actually have all of the materials, and they did not microfilm them very well. And this is a typical example of what his notes look like. You can see that he sort of starts with an original concept and sort of riffs off of it, coming with different example sentences and different permutations of the verbs like snow or it snows, it snowed, it will snow, that sort of thing. Not many people did data like this with example sentences this early in the documentation of language, so it's extremely handy. And here's another typical example of some of his notes of what they look like. He sort of runs through certain example sentences and gives word-for-word glosses for them. And he did this for about, this was actually his job. He actually did this for about 5 or 6 different tribes that were around the Great Lakes in the 1820s. And just for continuity's sake, he got a set of month names as well. And I have not been able to find his month names in his field notes, but he published them. And so you can see Crane month is here as well. I think though it was translated as April in an earlier set of notes and so forth. But it's not the same set. For instance, he did not appear to get any month name named Raccoon month. So this is interesting because it's an example of how the month names were not set in stone, but they were flexible based on the ecological living conditions of where they were living. He was not working in southern Illinois. He was working in northern Indiana. So. And to hurry things up a bit, Albert Gatschet, who some of you have probably heard of, was the first linguist to get really extensive English language materials on the Myaamia and Peoria languages, as it was now called. He was born in Switzerland in 1832. He immigrated to America and worked for the BAE, which later became the Smithsonian, until his death in 1907. And he collected vast amounts of data, almost none of it published, on Myaamia, Peoria, and Wea speakers in Oklahoma and Indiana, though mainly Oklahoma. He was the first person to collect native Miami, Illinois texts, native stories that were not translations of religious materials, and collected about 25 texts, I think, depending on how you count. He collected a huge amount of vocabulary, and there's over 8,000 file cards, possibly, depending on how you count them as well, because there's some repetition, maybe as many as 12,000, and extensive notes with a lot of ethnological data. So for example, this is an example of one of his more interesting of his 8,000 plus vocabulary cards. This happens to be the main card he gave for the word for sweat lodge, and where he basically was just writing down what his speaker told him how sweat lodges were used. And Nobody else was writing down this kind of stuff in Oklahoma in the 1800s. So there's a huge amount of cultural as well as linguistic detail that can be culled out of this. This is what his stories look like. This is the story of Usaka Chaka, which I've talked about in public before, and which is in the storybook. He got this. This is an incredibly valuable document. He got this from Elizabeth Valley, who was born Myaamia in western Ohio in 1813, and who did not speak English. And he had to use interpreters to speak with her. And this is I think about 20 pages in the original. And I'm still working with the story to this day. And it's a trickster story that's extremely similar to stories from other neighboring Algonquian languages. This is a list, just to let you know, he did it too. This is a list of Gatschet's Miami month names as well, and you can see some of the very same names popping up, but not always in the same order, and some new ones as well. So Crane month as well, and Buck month, and Young Buck month. Gatschet got some data on Myaamia place names in Indiana and Oklahoma, and this is a set of his explanations of what his speakers told him, what some of the names in northern Indiana meant. And he did do there are some places in his notes where he simply wrote down ethnographic detail, where he sort of was not so much just collecting words, but just writing down what his speakers told him about Miami culture. And this is some of what he wrote down on the Miami uses of tobacco. And the second last person, and probably the most people have heard of, is Jacob Dunn. His work on Miami was probably the first that was ever published for a very long time, and so if you've ever heard only one person who worked on Miami, it's him. And he lived from 1855 to 1924, and he worked with Miami, Wea, and Peoria speakers in Oklahoma and Indiana from 1906 till sometime around 1914. I've never been able to find out when he stopped working. And he got re-elicited most of the text Gatschet got, and he worked extensively with Gabriel Godefroy, which Gatschet did not do. He was the most fluent speaker of Indiana Myaamia that any of these people worked with. And he collected hundreds of pages of field notes, several hundred file cards, and numerous example sentences and cultural details. And his notes are all at the Indiana State Library now, where I got copies of them all in the early 90s. And this is a sample. These are from Dunn's file cards, his index cards. His cards aren't always this detailed, but if there was something that he found really interesting that seemed significant culturally about the Myaamia, he took down a lot of detail on it. This is the 2.5 cards that he got on Miami corn terms. This showed that Dunn actually had a pretty good relationship with the speakers that he worked with, and they probably told him more about Miami culture than and he was probably more empathetic about Miami culture and more fond of Miami culture than any of the other people who worked on the language and had genuine friends in the community, which is why he was able to get as much data as he did. And this is a list of the month names he got. Again, this is the month names that were in use in northern Indiana in around 1905 or 1907, so they're not exactly the same as the ones that Gatschet would have gotten in Oklahoma in the 1890s. But again, the thing about the month, when you compare the 13 or so different sets of month names we have, there's similar terms among all of them, but none of them are exactly the same as each other. So you can see how the system sort of, changed and adapted for different locations and different time periods. And just as a quick sample of the grammatical stuff, he actually, for a person who never had any linguistic training, he was actually pretty good about the linguistic stuff. He was actually better than Gatschet, and Gatschet actually was a professional linguist. And this is a sample of what he wrote down for the verb to say. And he got an awful lot of data. It's not phonetically accurate, but if you learn about the pronunciation of the language, you can interpret it very easily. And as I said before, one of the big differences in Dunn's work was he was the only person who really worked extensively with Godefroy, and he thus was the person who got Godefroy's Miami origin story. Gatschet never got this, probably because he didn't have as good a relationship with Godefroy. And It's not as extensive as we wish. I suspect that a longer story, that Godfrey probably knew a longer version of this, but he got a 3-page version of this from Godfrey around 1904 or so, which is completely priceless, which is the story of where the Myaamia first appeared, probably somewhere around the St. Joseph River in Miami, in Michigan. Seems to be what he's talking about. And another story he got was he got an underwater panther story from Godfrey as well, which no one else got. The appearance of an underwater panther on the Mississippi River in northern Indiana. And finally, before I wrap this up, just one last person I should mention, Truman Michaelson, who lived from 1879 to 1938. And he worked for the Bureau of American Ethnology from 1910 to 1938 till his time of his death. And he did field work on a dozen different Algonquian languages. He did a massive amount of field work on Meskwaki. But he did about 1 week's worth of field work on Peoria in Oklahoma in 1916 with George Finley and Bill Skye. He was the only anthropologically trained person. He was the closest thing to a real linguist who worked on the language and who actually got kinship terms. And they're probably the most phonetically accurate recordings of Myaamia Peoria that anyone ever got, which is why they're valuable. And it's a shame he only was there for a week, though he also did get some English language Miami and Peoria stories, which are in the storybook. And this is some of Michelson's kinship notes from Bill Skye. The reason these are valuable is because Michaelson was the first person after the Jesuit missionaries 200 years before, really, that knew what questions to ask, that simply didn't go to the speakers and say, how do you say brother, how do you say sister, how do you say aunt, you know? Because the system is vastly more complicated than that. Since he knew how the system worked in other Algonquian languages, he knew what kind of questions to ask and what permutations to ask. And he got all the in-law terms and the terms for the several different kinds of sibling terms that exist. And this is a set of the verb paradigms he got in the language, which, again, he was the first person since the missionaries to know how Algonquian verbs worked, so his notes are especially valuable, and he also was phonetically a lot more accurate than the French missionaries, so it's especially high-quality data here as well. And you can see there's even a couple places in this page where he's comparing the Peoria verb he was getting with the Fox forms, or Meskwaki, since he'd already worked on that language. You see where he's saying Fox, 2 forms there he's comparing to Fox. And just real quick, this is the set of month names he got from Finley in Oklahoma. And it's about an 80% overlap with what the other terms in the 20th and late 19th century were like. And these have been, so you can see from here where the Miami calendar research that we've done comes from. It actually is an embarrassment of riches. We have information on the Myaamia calendar from several people, and it's over a very long time span. And I do believe that is it. Are there any questions of any kind? Yes, you down in front.
Of all of that data, how much or what percentage would you estimate has been utilized today?
You mean like just utilized in that we've managed to consult it? I would say maybe 20 to 30%, something like that, especially the modern stuff we've got a good handle on because it's easier to key in and easier to collate. But when you get back to the French dictionaries and you're getting to untranslated French materials of 500 pages, yes, that's a lot of that is still full of surprises that we don't know, which is why when Daryl asked me what he thought we should do for the NEH grant, I thought, well, the Laboulanger dictionary has not been published anywhere. It's not been keyed into computer anywhere. It's got a huge number of example sentences, and my French reading ability is not as good as it should be. But I'm saying if we're going to do one document where we're going to, mine everything, that's one of the places to start. So that's why we chose that. But there's a lot of data that I have not fully gone through. It just hasn't been enough time yet. Yeah.
In addition to the Detroit library that you referenced, where are the other repositories of these dictionaries and these?
Okay, yeah, that's an easy question to answer. Gatschet's materials and many of Dunn's materials are all at the National Anthropological Archives in Maryland, right outside DC. And I've been there 2 or 3 times to make sure I have everything, and I think I have everything by now. Most of Dunn's materials got deposited at the Indiana State Library, and I went there in 1991 and got most of, on a quick one-day trip and got most of what they have. The Gravier dictionary is at the Trinity College at Watkins Library at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. They've had it for over 100 years. The Pinette dictionary is in a obscure seminary in rural Quebec. The Laboulanger dictionary is at Brown University in Rhode Island. The Michaelson materials are also at the Anthropological Archives in the Smithsonian. Mostly, yeah, but for the modern stuff, the bulk of the stuff is at the Smithsonian. So, and like I said, I am convinced there may still be other Jesuit manuscripts out there. It's just hard to know where to look, but it really brought it home to me when a new one was found in '99 that no one had known about before.
So anything in Europe?
Excellent question. We think there may be stuff that was brought all the way back to Europe when the Jesuits were kicked out of North America. But I've poked around with this some, but I have yet to find out where a good place to start would be, because it was kind of chaotic when the materials were brought back to Europe, or when the Jesuits were pulled out. It was kind of chaotic where the materials went. In fact, some of the materials that are in Connecticut and Rhode Island are only there because they were essentially taken from Quebec when the English took over Quebec. They were taken by force and later sold into private hands, and they were private collectors' hands for a while until eventually they were sold to libraries, fortunately. There could be stuff in the Vatican, there could be stuff in France. It's really not certain. We need to dig around some more and see. Most of these new things turn up in little libraries in Quebec, when they do turn up. Yeah?
That's a lot of data. How long is it going to take you to get through the 70%?
If I live to be 95, that would maybe be enough. Honestly, seriously. I mean, to do this properly and with enough close care and attention and to get through everything, I've been doing this for about 24, 23 years. It'd be over twice that, easily.
And are you the only person working on it?
Yes, as far as I know. If there's another person, they've hidden themselves very well. Yes, I am the only, as far as I know, I am the only linguist, well, yes, I am the only linguist working on this stuff right now. Yeah?
David, I think I probably understand the motivation behind the French Jesuits' work on compiling these dictionaries. But what about Gatschet in 1879? What was the motivation that are done in the early 1900s? Who was funding that work, and what was their purpose?
Well, Gatschet was one of the first generation. He was one of the earliest sort of proto-anthropologists, or he was kind of the predecessor. Well, he worked for the BAE just when it started. He was one of the very first people when the BAE started. And it was basically an academic attempt to sort of just document these, for the most part, the frontier had been conquered, and, there was now a growing academic interest in who these people were and what languages they spoke. And he was not very well trained. He had passable phonetic sense and spoke superb English and was extremely dogged in his persistence. But it was purely for an academic basis, really. It was his job. And he worked on dozens of languages, actually, Gatschet did, and published very little of what he got. Actually, mostly he would collect data and dump it at the Smithsonian and then go back out. Dunn was a different story. Dunn was sort of a gentleman scholar. He was a lawyer who was independently wealthy and financially comfortable. He lived right near several Myaamia speakers in northern Indiana. I'm not sure how he first got to know the Myaamia in Indiana, but he was good friends with many of them and seemed to admire the culture. And I think he seems to have had some knowledge of what some scholars were doing. He knew about Gatschet's work, and he didn't think Gatschet was competent, and he thought, he could do better, and he did do better in some ways. And he just kind of, most of Dunn's work that wasn't on the Myaamia language was on Indiana history. And I think he viewed it as his way of sort of just documenting this part of researching being a Hoosier, you know, just researching the history of Indiana in its totality, you know, because he also wrote about, you know, the history of white people doing things in Indiana as well. Yeah?
The choice of the spelling of the spoken words of the languages was made by...
Who's the choice that who made? The choice that we made, or the choice that the recorders made?
The recorders, the spoken words of the language. Who made the choice for the spelling?
Oh, so how did they decide how they were going to write these words? Oh, okay. The Jesuits had already had a system in place for recording Algonquian and Iroquoian languages. One of the things I could have mentioned is that by the time the Jesuits first started working with the Illinois in the 1670s, they had already been working for several decades with other groups further up the Great Lakes and down the St. Lawrence River. So they already had several decades worth of previous work with Algonquian languages, mostly Ojibwe dialects, behind them. And they weren't coming to this project cold. You know, they sort of knew from Ojibwe, which is closely related, what sort of things you could expect in a new Algonquian language, and they had a sense of what the sound system would be like. They had a system that was basically based on French. They had a standard, they seemed to have a standard alphabet for recording Indian languages that they taught their new missionaries. And the Jesuits actually had a school in Montreal where incoming missionaries from France would be trained and taught what to expect and what symbols to use and so forth. There's slight personal preferences, but over the 40-year span of Illinois materials we have, the spelling systems are actually remarkably consistent, which to me indicates that before they even hit the field, they were saying, this is how we spell this. Because the purpose of the materials, actually I could have answered this for your question earlier, the purpose of the Illinois materials were basically to train future missionaries to understand the language when they hit the field, right? They had no inkling that people would be looking at them in 300 years for scientific value. And I'm sure they had no concept that they were scientifically interesting. They just when some new missionary came over speaking nothing but French, they wanted him to be able to hit the ground running. As for the later people, it was more or less ad hoc. Trowbridge kind of used an English-based system which is has all the faults of English spelling, and he uses it pretty inconsistently. So different symbols for vowels can mean several different things. Gatschet, however, used a system. The Bureau of American Ethnology and Powell in the 1860s and 1870s had devised a sort of prototype alphabet for recording Indian languages for work that the BAE financed. And Gatschet used that system. Somehow or another, my time is up. Dunn also used the same system, and a more sophisticated version of it was found in the later stuff. So I think that's all the time I have.